Maschinengewehr gesichtet!
The Battle of Vimy Ridge. World War I saw thousands of battles fought right across Europe and the Middle East. Each of them had their own significance, each of them was fought for what each side thought was right, and each of them shouldn't be forgotten. Today, the Battle of Vimy Ridge is being remembered. 100 years on, Canadian troops were right in the middle of fighting the Germans on ground that the French had previously lost on, and while it was seen as a true success for Canada and the Allied forces on the Western Front, it didn't come without its cost. To give you guys some background as to how the Battle of Vimy Ridge came to be, we need to take a step back first of all to 1914, the first year of the war and what was known as the Race to the Sea. The Germans and the Allied forces in the north of France and Belgium were jostling with each other, trying to outflank each other in order to secure ground and more strategic locations. By October 1914, the Germans had secured Vimy Ridge, just before the War of Motion slowed down to one of attrition. Trenches were dug, the sides settled in, and the years that followed, many attempts were made by the French to recapture land that they'd lost. Numerous attacks in 1915 failed, with the French 1st Moroccan Division managing to take the ridge very briefly, but losing it again due to lack of reinforcements. All in all, the French lost roughly 150,000 men trying to retake the ridge. The ridge itself is what's known as an escarpment. That's a steep slope between a relatively flat section of land, one much lower and one much higher. Think of it as a cliff between land and sea. It's flat at the bottom and flat at the top, but you've got a very steep slope connecting the two. The Germans were dug in at the top, and they had essentially an unrestricted view for miles around. That's a rather strategic point for them to hold on to. In February 1916, the French forces were relieved by the British, which allowed the French to strengthen their defences at Verdun, and then in October, the Canadians were sent in to relieve the British on the western slopes of the ridge. Now, the Canadians fighting at Vimy Ridge were part of an overarching battle, much larger than Vimy Ridge itself, and that was known as the Battle of Arras. This was devised by the British High Command, who had control of the Canadian troops, but for the first time in the war, all 4 Canadian divisions were grouped together for their own attack. They were supported by a 5th British Division with artillery and supplies. Before the attack was planned, however, and this can be attributed to the success of the Canadian operation, extensive reviews and analysis of the French army at Verdun were conducted by Canadian officers. Robert Nivelle, a French general at the time, was the architect of the counter-offensive that saw the French storm German defensive positions after rigorous training and repetition and inflict heavy damage, taking back a lot of ground that had been lost in the previous months. For the Canadians, this training consisted of smaller ridges behind the front lines being used, tape marking out the German trenches, and officers on horseback carrying a flag marking the current location of artillery bombardment. That kind of practice went over and over and over before the official Battle of Vimy Ridge. From these meetings with French officials, the Canadians devised a plan of attack that centred around 4 lines: black, red, blue and brown. There's an image on the screen right now showing you these, and you can also see the 4 Canadian divisions marked on the map as well. The northern 2 divisions were tasked with advancing to the black line and seizing the Germans' defences, and then onto the red line, which was the highest point of the ridge. The southern 2 divisions, whilst making these forward pushes, were also tasked with completing 2 more objectives: advancing to the blue line, which would see them take a small town and the woods surrounding the village of Vimy, and then finally the brown line, which would then take land occupied by the German 2nd defensive line. All of these attacks would utilise the creeping barrage tactic, and that sees infantry advance just behind an artillery bombardment, and that would provide them extensive cover from the German fire and likely force the Germans into a retreat. The plan also required very swift movement of the troops and artillery supporting them. Troops would leapfrog one another to provide a consistent momentum against the German lines, and if all went to plan, the Canadians believed they would have the majority of Vimy Ridge under control by 1 PM on the first day of the attack. The battle started at 5:30 AM. A quick mention before moving into the battle itself though, tunnelling. This was a major part of the Vimy Ridge battle, and the British troops who'd been stationed there before the Canadians relieved them in October 1916 had constructed huge networks of tunnels under no man's land and beyond under the German trenches. These tunnels house ammunition stores, water reservoirs and headquarters as well, and it also provided a completely covered route from the reserve lines all the way up to the front, so soldiers could move unseen to their proper positions. On the morning of the 9th of April, Easter Monday 1917, the assault began. It was due to begin a day before on Easter Sunday, but at the request of the French, the assault was delayed. This might have been due to the religious significance of the day. After a solid night of artillery bombardment from the British and Canadian guns just before 5:30 AM, the guns stopped. At this point, the Germans knew an attack was coming. Just a month or so earlier, a German-born Canadian soldier had deserted and filled them in on many of the key aspects of the attack. But as planned, at 5:30 AM, all of the silenced guns fired their first shell. And 30 seconds later, hundreds of mine charges were detonated in the now cleared tunnels underneath no man's land and underneath the front German defences. The Canadian soldiers went over the top and began their push to capture the German lines. The creeping barrage of artillery bombardment was moving forward in increments, approximately 100 metres or so every 3 minutes, and then heavier howitzers landed shells beyond those to weaken and destroy much larger German defences. The first 3 Canadian divisions managed to secure their first objective, the Black Line, by 6:25 AM, which was just 55 minutes after the battle started. By roughly 7 AM, both the 1st and 2nd Divisions had reportedly met their second objective, which was the Red Line, and this would allow the 3rd and 4th Divisions to come in and capture the High Point, or what was known as the Pimple. The 3rd Division reported reaching the Red Line around 7:30 AM. However, the Canadian 4th Division had had issues from the outset. Their commanding officer had ordered the artillery not to destroy a portion of the German front line, presumably so the Canadians could utilise it as cover before their push forward. This section was home to various German machine gun nests, and these pinned down the soldiers and ultimately killed hundreds of them as they tried to advance. By the end of the first day, the Canadians had made significant ground on the Germans, but they'd lost the village of Vimy back to the Germans the same day. As night fell, the Germans were bringing in reinforcements and the Canadians dug themselves into their newly captured positions. On April 10th, the next day, the British brought in reinforcements for the Canadian 1st and 2nd Divisions, and their instructions were to leapfrog them and push onto the 3rd objective, which was the Blue Line. That push started at 9:30 AM, and approximately 90 minutes later, the town of Thalus had been captured. Artillery continued to bombard the land 100 metres or so beyond the stationary troops, and machine guns were brought forward to provide covering fire towards the final objective, which was the Brown Line. By 2 PM, both the 1st and 2nd Divisions had reportedly captured their final objective. April the 11th was due to be the last day of the battle, but due to the 4th Division suffering major casualties on their first day, combat was extended into April 12th. The final movements of the assault were made on this day. The 4th Division had yet to succeed in taking the high point of the ridge known as the Pimple. You can see it here on this image. It's a very thin section jutting out on the Red Line that was still being defended by German soldiers. There was a failed attack during the early hours at 4 AM by the Canadians, but that was relaunched 1 hour later, this time supported with strong artillery shelling. That saw the 4th Division push through the gaps in the German lines, and by 6 PM that day, the Pimple was in Canadian territory. Although the fighting and the success of the Canadian soldiers at Vimy Ridge was seen as a big victory for the Allies overall, of course it came with large losses. Over 10,000 casualties were suffered, with 3,600 of those being killed, and all of that within just a 4-day assault. However, considering Canada as a nation sat under British control during the war, this battle is seen by many as a coming of age for Canada, an action that signalled the country as a strong force, and it gave people a sense of national identity. All 4 divisions of Canadian soldiers battled together and achieved their goals that in previous battles the French had failed to do on several occasions. And that's the story of Vimy Ridge. I decided to make this video to highlight the efforts of Canadian soldiers exactly 100 years ago, and to give people a chance to understand what actually happened. I did a similar video on the Christmas truce of 1914, and I got a lot of positive comments asking for me to highlight more of these events during World War I, and considering the national pride that Canadians have for their success in this battle, I thought it was a fitting time to tell that story. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, my name is Westie, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.